Welcome back, everyone. Today we're really going deep, like way down the rabbit hole with Isaac Newton.
Ooh, sounds intense.
Yeah, but we're not talking about apples and gravity. We're exploring his fascination with alchemy, theology, and even prophecy.
You mean like the guy who figured out gravity was also into the occult?
Exactly. And we're basing this deep dive on, well, what you've shared with us from the metaphysical world of Isaac Newton. It's going to be wild.
Buckle up.
So for centuries, Newton was seen as, well, purely rational.
Right, like Mr. Science.
But he was actually super into these mystical subjects, not just later in life.
Yeah, that's the common misconception that it was just a phase.
But you're saying it was lifelong. What makes you say that?
Well, think about it. Even when he was rocking the scientific world with Principia Mathematica back in 1687,
Right, his masterpiece.
people were already like, whoa, this guy's different.
Okay, so he was brilliant,
Hmm?
but lots of geniuses are a little eccentric.
True. But check this out. There's this story about the Marquis de l'Hôpital.
Who was he again?
He was a French mathematician.
Okay.
And he read Principia and was just floored. Like, he was blown away by it.
Makes sense. It's pretty dense stuff.
Yeah. And he wondered, does Newton even eat or sleep? Is he even human?
Uh-huh, right. So even then, people knew he was on another level.
Totally. But then, fast forward to 1936, there's this big auction at Sotheby's in London.
Ooh, an auction. What were they selling?
Newton's personal manuscripts, stuff that had been hidden away for ages.
And what was in them?
Alchemy, theology, prophecy, the whole nine yards.
Wow. So it wasn't just a passing interest.
Nope, it was a serious dedication.
What was the reaction when these manuscripts came out?
People were shocked. Like, here's the father of modern science, and he's deep into all this unscientific stuff.
So who ended up with all these manuscripts?
Well, Abraham Yehuda, an expert in ancient Semitic languages,
Yeah.
he got a bunch of the theological ones, and he was amazed by how complex they were.
And the others?
Well, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, you know,
Yeah, I know him.
he bought a lot of the alchemical writings,
Mm-hmm.
and he famously called Newton the last of the magicians.
Last of the Magicians. That's pretty evocative.
Right, like this blend of scientific genius and, well, a fascination with magic.
Makes you wonder what he thought he could achieve with it all.
Totally. And speaking of mysteries, you mentioned prophecy earlier. Was he really trying to predict the end of the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I've heard, but come on. Newton, the end of the world.
He was definitely obsessed with the Book of Revelation, like he thought it held a secret code to the future.
Okay, but Newton was all about logic and reason. How does that square with prophecy?
Good question. It seems like he genuinely believed that the Bible, specifically Revelation, contained a roadmap, like a hidden timeline of future events.
Really? So how did he go about decoding it?
He meticulously analyzed the text like he was trying to crack a cipher.
So did he come up with any concrete predictions?
Oh, he did. He even calculated that the apocalypse would happen in 2060.
2060. Hold on, we're recording this in 2025. That's not that far off.
Right. It definitely raises some eyebrows, but it shows how deeply he believed in a universe governed by divine order, even down to future events.
Okay, but prophecy aside, you mentioned that Newton had some pretty radical views on Christianity itself, right?
Oh, yeah. Big time. Like, he straight up rejected the Trinity.
The Trinity, that's kind of a core Christian belief, isn't it?
Definitely a big one. He saw it as a later correction of early Christianity, like it was obscuring the true nature of God.
Okay, so Newton's challenging centuries of established doctrine, what led him to that conclusion?
He dove deep into early biblical texts, way deeper than most people would go.
Makes it so he was like a biblical scholar too.
Yeah, and he became convinced that the passages supporting the Trinity were actually added later.
Like someone was tampering with the Bible.
That's what he thought, and he had reasons to believe it. It all goes back to this conflict between two early church figures, Athanasius and Arius.
Okay, I'm sensing another deep dive coming on.
You got it. So Athanasius was all about the Trinity,
Mhm.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all equal.
Yeah, the classic Trinity.
Right. But Arius, he had a different take. He thought Jesus was, like, subordinate to God the Father.
So more of a created being than equal to God.
Exactly. And this debate, well, it raged for centuries.
Wow.
And after all his research, Newton sided with Arius. He even thought that some of the passages supporting the Trinity were, like, intentionally added later.
To control the narrative, maybe?
You got it. He saw it as a power play by the church.
So Newton was basically playing biblical detective.
He was. And one of the big pieces of evidence he pointed to was something called the Comma Johanneum.
But what now?
Yeah, it's a phrase in the first epistle of John that explicitly backs up the Trinity.
Okay.
But Newton thought it was a fake, like it was slipped in centuries after the original text was written.
So he saw it as a deliberate attempt to distort the Bible's message.
Exactly. He even debated this with John Locke, the philosopher, showed him all his research and everything.
Wow, Newton taking on the establishment. He really wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, was he?
Not at all. And this debate, it gets even wilder when you look at the Council of Tyre in 335 AD.
Okay, what happened there?
Well, Athanasius was basically put on trial for heresy and all sorts of misconduct.
Sounds intense.
It was. Super political, lots of backstabbing, the whole works.
Ancient church politics, eh?
Yeah, and get this. At one point, they bring out this woman who accuses Athanasius of sexual assault.
Whoa, serious accusation.
And she shows up with this mysterious figure known as the Black Dwarf.
The Black Dwarf? Who was that?
No one knows for sure. Some say it was a priest in disguise trying to sabotage Athanasius.
So a total setup.
Could be. Either way, it was chaos. People were freaking out, and it all contributed to Athanasius getting condemned and exiled.
Wow, what a story. So this whole council was a turning point for Athanasius.
Yeah, and it seems like it really solidified Newton's skepticism about him, too.
Makes sense. I mean, imagine trying to piece together these ancient events
Yeah.
centuries later, trying to figure out what really happened.
Exactly. And it shows how Newton was trying to understand how Christian thought evolved, how it got to where it was in his time.
And he wasn't afraid to question the official narrative.
Not one bit. But his fascination with the past, it went way beyond just Christianity. You know, we talked about the Prisca Sapientia earlier, ancient wisdom.
Right, the idea that ancient cultures had access to knowledge we've lost.
Exactly. And Newton was convinced that figures like Pythagoras and Moses, they had this deep understanding of the universe.
So he wasn't just interested in their religious or philosophical ideas, but in their scientific insights, too.
Oh, totally. He thought they had knowledge that predated modern science, like it was encoded in myths and biblical texts.
So like a hidden code waiting to be cracked.
Yeah. And he was searching for that code everywhere. He saw it in ancient myths, in the Bible, even in the architecture of ancient buildings.
So he's going from prophecy to early Christianity to ancient wisdom. My head's spinning. How did he even connect these things in a practical way?
Well, take the myth of the net from Ovid's Metamorphoses, for example.
Refresh my memory. What's that one about?
It's about Venus, Mars, and Vulcan getting caught in a net, right?
Okay, and?
Newton saw it as an allegory for an alchemical experiment.
Whoa, hold on. A myth as an alchemy recipe.
Yep. He thought the gods in the myth represented different elements like copper, iron, and heat.
Pretty creative.
Right. But there's another layer.
Of course there is.
He thought the alchemical process itself was actually a corrupted version of, like, an even older astronomical understanding of the universe.
So we've got a myth, an alchemical recipe, and a lost astronomical insight, all rolled into one.
Exactly. And for Newton, that was just the tip of the iceberg. He was constantly blurring the lines between disciplines, searching for that ultimate unified theory of
It
everything.
makes you wonder what he could have accomplished if he had, like, unlimited time and resources.
I know, right? But even brilliant minds have their limits. And let's be real, this kind of relentless intellectual exploration, it takes a toll.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to forget that geniuses are still human, you know?
Totally. And remember, this was a time when scientific exploration was high stakes. You could get into serious trouble for challenging the wrong ideas.
True. And then there was Newton's personality, too.
Yeah.
He was notoriously reclusive and, well, intense.
Yeah, not exactly Mr. Social Butterfly.
So was all this pressure getting to him?
It seems like it. Like in 1693, he had a full-on nervous breakdown.
A nervous breakdown. Wow, that's heavy. What triggered it?
It's hard to say for sure, but the stress of his work was probably a big factor. And then there's this story about his encounter with the infamous Judge Jeffreys.
Judge Jeffreys, the hanging judge.
Hmm.
What was Newton doing mixed up with him?
Yeah, rough character, right? It seems like they crossed paths when Newton was trying to get a position in London.
Okay, so he was navigating the world of politics.
Yeah, and this encounter seems to have really freaked him out.
I can imagine. Going from quiet Cambridge to dealing with someone like Jeffreys, that's a huge shift.
Totally. And this whole experience, it might have contributed to his reluctance to publish his work, you know.
Like he was afraid of the consequences.
It's possible. He knew his discoveries were powerful, and maybe he was worried about them being misused.
That's interesting, like a kind of moral dilemma, the responsibility of knowledge.
Right. And speaking of challenging topics, we can't ignore his fascination with alchemy.
Alchemy. Okay, now that's where things get really weird, even for Newton.
You think, the guy's trying to turn lead into gold, and he's also the father of modern physics.
Exactly. How did he reconcile those two worlds in his mind?
That's the million-dollar question. Some people think alchemy was just a distraction for him, like a hobby that got out of hand.
So a waste of his time and genius.
Yeah, some people see it that way, but others think it was more than that. Like alchemy was a way for him to understand the universe at its most fundamental level.
So not just about making gold, but about cracking the code of creation itself.
Exactly. He thought alchemy held the keys to understanding matter and the forces that govern the universe.
Makes sense, in a way. He was always looking for those deeper connections, those underlying principles.
Right. And it's easy to judge him through our modern lens, but back then, alchemy was a legitimate field of study, you know?
True. People were still trying to figure out how the world worked.
Yeah, and Newton was always pushing the boundaries, exploring every avenue. But tragically, a lot of his alchemical work was lost in a fire.
Oh no, how did that happen?
Apparently, a candle left burning in his lab.
Classic lab accident. What did he lose?
A ton of his alchemical writings, but also early work on calculus and optics. Imagine what went up in smoke that day.
It's heartbreaking to think about, but it reminds us that even geniuses aren't invincible, you know?
Totally. And it makes you wonder what else he might have achieved if he hadn't lost all that work.
Absolutely. But hey, even without that lost work, his legacy is immense. And it wasn't all done in isolation, right? He had a pretty famous friend, Edmund Halley.
Ah, yes, Haley's comic guy. But he was way more than just that, you know?
Okay, so tell me more about this dynamic duo.
Well, first off, Halley was the one who convinced Newton to publish Principia.
So he was like Newton's hype man.
Haha, kind of. He saw how brilliant it was and pushed Newton to share it with the world.
Good looking out. What else did they work on together?
Astronomy was their jam. Like, they refined calculations for planetary orbits, studied comets, all sorts of cool stuff.
Makes sense. They were both top minds in astronomy.
But there's this story about Newton and the Great Comet of 1680. That's pretty wild.
Okay, what happened?
So in 1724, Newton's in his 80s at this point, and he makes this prediction about the Great Comet.
Uh-oh, sounds ominous.
He says it might come back in 500 years and, get this, collide with the sun.
A comet hitting the sun, what would that even do?
He didn't go into too much detail, but he suggested it could, like, superheat the sun.
And make Earth uninhabitable, I'm guessing?
Yeah, that was the implication. So the guy who figured out gravity is also talking about a cosmic apocalypse.
It's mind-blowing. Science and prophecy all mixed up together.
Totally.
Yeah.
So what stands out to you most from what we've covered so far?
Honestly, the sheer scope of his interests. He wasn't just a scientist. He was a theologian, a historian, a mystic, all rolled into one.
Right, like he was driven to understand everything.
It makes you think about how we categorize knowledge today. Like, Newton didn't see these hard lines between disciplines.
That's a good point. Maybe we could learn something from that.
Totally. It's like he was searching for a single unifying principle, something that connected everything in the universe.
And for Newton, that unifying principle might have been the Prisca Sapientia, the ancient wisdom that we talked about.
yeah, the idea that ancient cultures held secrets we've lost.
He thought it was the key to understanding everything, from the laws of physics to the meaning of life itself.
Okay, so we've seen how Newton was into alchemy and prophecy.
And how he challenged the Trinity.
Right, but there's another area where all these interests, like, come together. His work on chronology.
Yeah, he wasn't just content with figuring out, like, the laws of the universe.
He wanted to untangle history, too.
Exactly. He thought ancient chronologies were full of errors and inconsistencies.
So he was basically fact-checking ancient history.
Pretty much. He thought he could apply a more scientific approach, you know, make it more accurate.
So, like, applying the same rigor he used for planetary orbits to ancient kings and stuff.
Yeah, he approached history with that same meticulous mindset.
Fascinating. So what kind of sources was he using for all this?
Oh, everything. Ancient Greek and Roman histories, biblical texts, astronomical records, even mythology.
Wow, talk about a wide range of sources. Was he trying to prove a particular point with all this?
Well, he was really keen on making ancient history line up with the Bible.
So reconciling those two different timelines.
Exactly. Trying to create a single unified timeline that worked for both history and religion.
Ambitious.
Yeah.
Did he ever publish any of this research?
He did. It came out after his death in 1728. The book's called The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended.
Amended. Sounds like he was making some serious changes to the accepted timeline.
He was. Like, he proposed a much shorter history for ancient civilizations.
Really? How much shorter are we talking?
Centuries in some cases.
Wow, that's bold. Why did he think history was shorter than everyone thought?
Well, he had a few reasons. Like, he thought the reigns of ancient kings were often exaggerated.
So like propaganda inflating their accomplishments?
Maybe. He was definitely skeptical of the traditional accounts.
Makes sense. He was all about evidence and logic.
Right. He was using those tools to, like, reinterpret the past.
Did he focus on any particular civilizations or time periods?
He was super into the ancient Greeks and Egyptians.
Oh, the classics.
Yeah, he questioned the dating of big events like the Trojan War and founding of Rome.
You mean those events might have happened later than we think?
That's what he argued, said they were centuries off.
I bet that caused a stir among historians.
Oh yeah, they were all abuzz. Some people admired his audacity, his willingness to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, that was kind of his thing.
But others thought his methods were, well, a bit too out there.
So mixed reactions.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Which is understandable, right? It's a huge claim to make, basically rewriting history.
totally. But okay, we've covered alchemy, prophecy, chronology, all these seemingly different interests. What's the takeaway here? Why should we care about all this?
That's the big question, isn't it? Like, some people look at all this and they think, well, this was just Newton going off the rails a bit.
Like these interests were holding him back from even greater scientific discoveries.
Yeah, they see it as a distraction, a sign that even geniuses can get sidetracked.
I see the point, but it seems like there's more to it than that.
Right. There are others who think we can't separate Newton's scientific work from all these other interests.
So like alchemy and prophecy weren't just hobbies, they were feeding into his scientific thinking.
Exactly. They see it all as part of a larger quest.
A quest for what?
For a unified understanding of the universe. He was trying to create a grand synthesis of knowledge, a theory of everything that encompassed both the material and the spiritual.
So he wasn't just trying to figure out how the universe works, but also why it works that way. It's deeper meaning.
Exactly. And for Newton, that meant drawing on all sorts of sources. Science, religion, ancient wisdom.
It's like he saw connections everywhere, these hidden threads linking seemingly disparate fields.
And that's what makes him so fascinating, right? He was constantly pushing boundaries, breaking down categories, searching for that ultimate truth that connected it all.
Makes you think about how we approach knowledge today. Maybe we become too specialized, too focused on narrow fields of study.
It's a good point. Maybe we could learn something from Newton's, well, his willingness to embrace the big picture.
Totally. He was a true polymath, a Renaissance man in his own right.
And for Newton, it all came back to that concept of prisca sapientia, ancient wisdom.
Right, the idea that ancient cultures knew things we've forgotten.
He thought it was the key to unlocking all sorts of secrets about the universe, about human nature, about everything.
So not just a historical curiosity, but a source of real practical knowledge.
Exactly. And to really understand this concept, we need to look at the specific figures who Newton believed embodied this ancient wisdom.
Okay, who are we talking about? You mentioned Pythagoras and Moses earlier?
Yeah, those were his big two. For Newton, they weren't just historical figures. They were like key holders to this lost knowledge.
Okay, so let's start with Pythagoras. Most people just know him for his theorem about triangles.
Right. A squared plus b squared equals c squared.
But Newton saw him as way more than just a mathematician, right?
Oh, absolutely. He saw Pythagoras as a mystic, a philosopher who understood the hidden harmony of the cosmos.
Harmony, like musical harmony.
Exactly. He was really into this idea of the harmony of the spheres.
What that?
The idea that the movements of celestial bodies create a kind of celestial music.
So like the universe is a giant symphony.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And Newton believed Pythagoras had tapped into this deeper level of understanding.
Did he think Pythagoras actually heard this music?
It's hard to say, but he definitely thought Pythagoras knew something we didn't about the mathematical principles behind the universe.
So how did this ancient knowledge make its way to Newton centuries later?
Newton believed it was passed down through secret societies and esoteric traditions.
So like a hidden lineage of knowledge from ancient Greece to 17th century England.
That's what he thought. And he saw himself as a part of that lineage, like he was carrying the torch.
Wow, that's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
But what about Moses? How did he fit into all this?
For Newton, Moses wasn't just a religious leader. He was a philosopher, a scientist, a holder of this ancient wisdom.
So he was reading the Bible not just for its spiritual message, but for its scientific insights.
Exactly. He believed that the Bible, especially the Old Testament, contained profound truths about the nature of reality.
So he saw Moses as like a proto-scientist.
In a way, yeah. He thought Moses had access to knowledge that had been lost or corrupted over time.
And Newton was trying to recover that knowledge.
Exactly. He was trying to decode the Bible to find the hidden scientific and philosophical truths within it.
So for Newton, science and religion weren't separate, they were intertwined.
That's a great way to put it. He saw them as complementary paths in the pursuit of truth.
This is really blowing my mind. It's like we're talking about a completely different Newton than the one I learned about in school.
Right. He was so much more than just the guy who figured out gravity.
He's a theologian, a historian, a mystic, a seeker of lost knowledge.
And it's all connected by this idea of the Prisca Sapientia, the ancient wisdom that he believed held the key to understanding everything.
Okay, so we're talking about this ancient wisdom, this Prisca Sapientia.
Right, the idea that ancient figures had access to some profound knowledge.
And Newton was trying to tap into that.
Exactly. He believed they held keys to unlocking some of the universe's biggest secrets.
You mentioned Pythagoras and Moses. Let's start with Pythagoras.
Okay, so most people know him for the Pythagorean theorem, right?
Yeah, the whole a squared plus b squared thing.
But Newton saw him as way more than just a math whiz.
So like a philosopher, a mystic.
Exactly. Newton believed Pythagoras understood the hidden mathematical and musical harmony of the cosmos, like deep down.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this harmony idea.
Well, it's called the harmony of the spheres. The idea that the movements of celestial bodies, like planets and stars, they create a kind of celestial music.
Like the universe is a giant symphony.
That's the idea. And Newton was fascinated by it. He thought Pythagoras was onto something really profound.
Did he think Pythagoras actually heard this music?
It's hard to say for sure, but he definitely thought Pythagoras had tapped into a deeper level of understanding.
About the mathematical principles governing the universe.
Exactly. Like the blueprint of creation.
So how did this ancient Pythagorean knowledge get to Newton?
Newton believed it was passed down through secret societies and esoteric traditions.
So like a secret chain of knowledge from ancient Greece to Newton.
That's what he believed. Like he was part of this ancient lineage.
That's pretty wild. But okay, what about Moses? Where does he fit in?
So for Newton, Moses wasn't just a religious figure.
He was more than just the guy with the Ten Commandments.
Way more. Newton saw him as a philosopher, a
Yeah.
scientist, a holder of this ancient wisdom.
So he was reading the Bible for more than just the spiritual message.
Absolutely. He thought the Bible, especially the Old Testament, contained deep truths about like the nature of reality.
So he's basically reading the Bible as a science textbook,
Not exactly, but he was definitely looking for those hidden scientific insights.
like a secret code hidden within the text.
Yeah, kind of. He thought Moses had access to knowledge that had been lost or corrupted over time.
And Newton was trying to rediscover it.
That was his mission, to decode the Bible and find those lost truths.
So for Newton, science and religion weren't separate things, they were intertwined.
That's a great way to put it. He saw them as different ways of approaching the same ultimate truth.
This is really changing how I think about Newton. I always thought of him as this purely rational scientific figure.
But he was so much more than that. He was a complex thinker wrestling with big questions about the universe and our place in it.
And it's all connected to this idea of Prisca Sapientia, this ancient wisdom.
Exactly. And remember, we've only scratched the surface here.
Right, there's so much more to explore.
There are tons of Newton's manuscripts that are still being studied and deciphered. Who knows what else we'll find?
Maybe even more shocking revelations.
Totally. It's like a never-ending puzzle.
And it reminds us that there's always more to learn, more connections to make, more mysteries to unravel.
And that the pursuit of knowledge, well, it shouldn't be limited by artificial boundaries.
That's what I take away from this whole deep dive.
Me too. Newton's story shows us that the most interesting discoveries often come from unexpected places, from blurring the lines between disciplines, from questioning everything.
It's about staying curious, being open to new ideas, and never being afraid to dive deep down the rabbit hole.
Because who knows what you might find down there?
Exactly. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that thirst for knowledge alive. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of history and ideas.